The bandwidth for this episode of the AR-15 podcast is sponsored by the Firearms Radio Network. FirearmsRadio.tv.
Welcome to episode number 124 of the AR-15 podcast. I'm your host, Reed Snyder, and tonight I'm flying solo. This is the podcast about your favorite black rifle. This show is for you, whether you're building your first AR or you've been building ARs for years. There is something we can all do to take our black rifle to the next level. Well, welcome tonight, everybody. I want to let you know that we here at the podcast, the AR-15 podcast, and at the Firearms Radio Network have been sitting down and trying to brainstorm some ideas that'll help us get the show kicked up maybe to the next level. Hopefully you're going to stick with us when we make some of those changes, but bear with us. We're going to have a little period of adjustment while we add some production values to our introduction and see what we can do to get the show hit on all 8 cylinders. So until then, I want to remind you that it is Brownells who helps make this show possible. So don't forget that Brownells, with their 100% lifetime satisfaction guarantee, is there for you anytime you have a problem. Like when you can't remove the taper pins from your new barrel to slip off the front sight base, and you now have to find a new barrel. So one of the things that we've been talking about is the Brownells Edge program. We had a listener write in and explain to us that after joining the Brownells Edge program, they were able to return 2 items they had acquired prior to joining the program, and Brownells just took care of it. Their free return shipping is really an awesome bonus. So we want to remind you, when you shop for your AR-15 parts, shop for them at Brownells. And if you'd like to help the podcast out, if you go to the link, ar15podcast.com/parts, that will divert a little bit of those proceeds to the show's coffers so that we can keep providing you the great content we always try to do. So, our main topic. Last week, we started off by trying to revisit building your AR from scratch. Now, I know way back in the dawn of our show, we tried to cover these topics, and it was a little disjointed, but we tried to do the best we could. So we're putting on a series of shows so that we can kind of take everything that we've learned in 123 episodes and try to lay it out for you. So last episode, part 1 of building an AR from scratch, we talked about what you're going to find in a lower receiver. So tonight we're going to talk about actually assembling that lower receiver. So since I have added some breaks to the content of the show, I think we're going to be more than 3 episodes. So guys, just bear with me. So we've got a receiver. Whatever the receiver is going to be, whether it's an 80% receiver milled to its final specs, or whether we're talking about something that is, straight off the, CNC machine with all of the bells and whistles, there's not really a whole lot you are going to need to do to your basic lower receiver. I kind of just tend to wipe my receiver off with a good clean towel, make sure that there's not any grease or oil or anything from shipping, and just begin. I'm sure that some of you might have different approaches, but from that point, I really don't go to any great effort. So when I build the lower receiver, I always start with my lower parts kit. There are a few components to the lower parts kit that I think it bears mentioning that there is some difficulty in the order or perhaps the complexity of the part itself. So let's kind of start with the order that I tend to build my lower. I like to start off with my mag catch first. And I'll tell you why, because if I put the bolt release in the rifle and drift the pin in, the roll pin in, I am always catching the bulk of that mag or the bolt catch release with my mag release as I'm tightening it into the mag release button. There is a essentially a bolt end on the mag release body that fits into your mag release button. And so, like a bolt and a nut, they have to be screwed in together. There's a spring that rests between them, and that provides the tension that resets your mag release back to its flush position. But I find myself having to get a pretty sturdy punch to just kind of rest the mag button on, put a lot of tension on that spring, and press the mag button into the well that's machined out for it, and then rotate the magazine release until it catches that threaded component in your button. So when I'm doing that and it's caught and it's beginning to basically tighten down to the level that I'm going to be comfortable with, I'm always catching that bolt catch. So I do the mag release assembly first, then I do the bolt catch. Now, we talked about some of the higher end and even some of the mid-grade lowers coming in with tapped holes that will receive essentially a hex head threaded pin. I'm finding that approach to really be an awesome time-saving finish protecting approach to securing these components in your rifle. So as I am evolving my tastes and preferences, I am drifting towards lowers that have that particular feature. So that's my preference, but it's only because I've scratched up the side of enough of my receivers to really be averse to the idea of doing it anymore. So if you are going to get a lower where your bolt catch is going to have basically a roll pin in there, my suggestion is to protect the side of the receiver. I like painter's tape. The adhesive doesn't really remain after you are finished with your job, and so I think cleanup's a lot easier than some other tapes could be. So I try to put several layers. It's amazing. You can gouge the tip of a punch pretty easily through a piece of that painter's tape. So several layers, I think, can help you. Of course, patience, don't rush. Those are two concepts that I think are very important if you really are going to try to assemble a rifle and not have as many nicks and scratches as I tended to have in my first build or two. So once you've protected the side of your receiver, and I would tend to tell you to take that protection up to the end around a threaded component that's going to receive your receiver extension tube, so that you can really protect from any glancing hammer blows or mallet blows or whatever you're using to drift your pins in. Then I think the next thing that I would suggest is if you're going to set a roll pin, use a roll pin punch. And not just the dimpled roll pin punch that fits in the end of the roll pin, but a starter punch is helpful as well, because the starter punch allows you to basically capture your roll pin in a recess at the end of the punch so that it doesn't shift its orientation as you're striking it. I used to get a piece of masking tape and tape the two together, and frankly, it's a whole lot easier to do with a starter punch. Once I get those two components on, the build really gets pretty simple from there. So I tend to next want to put in my front pivot pin that's going to secure the upper receiver to the lower in conjunction with the takedown pin. But this is something that for years has always been a frustrating part of any build for me. It's just a matter of uh, careful positioning of the pin and the springs and whatever it is you're going to use to assemble the two. But I've come up with a couple of shortcuts, and I'm sure many of you experienced AR builders have probably come up with your own or have been using what I envisioned for many years before I ever came up with it. So I guess that means it's not my original idea, which I'm pretty sure it's not. One way I've found is to take a punch that's the same diameter as the whole as the basically as the takedown pin or the pivot pin. You put that into the lower receiver, not from the same side that you would be inserting the pin from, but from the back side. And so it's going to go through both holes, and then you're going to basically rest it just at the edge of that second hole. I put the spring in, I put the detent in, and then I butt the face of my punch to those pins, and I just press them down with my thumb. As soon as they recess into the receiver, the punch comes across, and they're basically set. So now I can basically mate up my pivot pin, my uh, pin I'm trying to install here, to the face of the punch and just carefully push it through, pushing the punch out the back way it came in. And as it goes, it captures that pin if I'm careful and I'm not rushing. And I don't have to worry about that pin shooting across the room and getting lost in shag green or green shag carpet. So that was one way that I devised for myself. And I was lucky enough to have a set of punches that had nothing to do with firearms. So there were some that were quite large. And the larger punch, one of the larger punches, was the exact diameter of my pivot pin. So that's one way. Another way is a tool that Brownell sells that really makes it even simpler than that to do the whole process, but it follows essentially the same idea. The only difference is that there is a hole in the tip of your uh, device, and it's very much shaped the same diameter and it's the same length as the punch I use. It just has an L-shaped end, so it's kind of like a toggle. It can rotate as you grab the short component of the L. But the hole allows you to set the spring, set your detent, and as you press them down with something like a paper clip or a very fine punch, once again, you find yourself with the spring and the detent trapped underneath the punch, and you drift your takedown pin through the first hole, and that captures the spring detent assembly, and you're done. So one thing to remember, though, is that the two pins, the takedown pin and the pivot pin, have different lengths and different heads. Your pivot pin is going to have, I guess it's going to have one edge of the head just clipped off. The other thing is that it's going to be longer. So once you get it inserted and it's the proper pin, you're going to rotate it until a groove that's milled into the pin catches that detent. So that pin is going to be oriented by that groove in the detent. It's going to be trapped in that orientation as long as it's connected to the rifle. And two, I guess, dimples on either end of that groove are going to be where that detent rests when you've got the pin all the way extended and all the way recessed. So there you go for that. Now, when it comes to the rear assembly for the takedown pin, it's usually a trapped pin. It's either trapped in some models by your grip or it's trapped in other models by your end plate. And once again, like I was talking about with your bolt catch, I am seeing some of these actually being trapped by a hex head threaded pin. And it basically goes into the hole right after your spring and traps the whole of the assembly in the milled out hole, or the milled out space for the detent and spring. So for me, I would rather once again have something that is going to be milled out with a spring and a trapped threaded head than to have something captured by an end plate or a handguard. Now, I will tell you, since most lower parts kits expect your detent and spring to be the same length for a setup where it's trapped by the end plate, you'll find if it's trapped by the handguard, you'll probably have to clip a few of the loops off of the spring so that it's going to fit, give you the proper tension, and not really frustrate you. So the difficulty we have here is that at the same time that you're going to be looking to assemble the rear detent, you're going to have to either assemble the handguard, or I'm sorry, the pistol grip, to trap a grip trapped detent spring, or you're going to have to put on your receiver extension, end plate, and castle nut for a end plate captured spring and detent assembly. So whichever one it is, know that you're going to have that component in the way from here on out once you seat and attach that takedown pin. So the difficulty with your grip being the place you'll have to trap that rear takedown pin detent and spring assembly is that that's the same place where you're going to have to trap the spring and detent for your safety selector. So you can at this point choose to either try to carefully piece together those rear components and fit this fire control group in, or install the fire control group and then go back and finish off the last couple of pieces around your rear detent, rear takedown pin, and detent and spring assembly. So, and bear with me, I'm sure I'm not using the proper terminology. I'm trying to be more descriptive and less technical. So, if we're going to assemble the fire control group, let's just touch on that so that you guys can get that piece put in and move on to the remainder. You're going to have two pins. One pin is going to go through the trigger, the disconnector, and the body of your lower receiver. The other pin is going to go through the hammer of the rifle and through the body of the lower receiver. So the hammer and the pin it connects is going to be the upper and more forward of the two holes. The trigger and disconnect is going to be the lower and rearward hole of your lower receiver. I always drift in the trigger. I don't think there's any way to do it other than drifting in the trigger first. So once again, this is something that I think befuddles a lot of folks. I've tended to go with either a setup like Brownells, or I'm sorry, not Brownells, like Geisley does, where they basically have a short trapping pin in there that you leave in place, position your trigger, and then drift your trigger pin, retaining pin, through the receiver, and it essentially drives out that placeholder until you get the trigger and disconnector seated. So if that is what you're going to have available, I think assembling it is pretty self-evident. If you don't, one of the things I like to do is use a punch once again. It's the same diameter as your pins, fire control group pins, and basically drift it in through the backside, capture the trigger, and capture your disconnector. And then as it clears the working side of your receiver, you just tap your new pin back through the same way. And as it drives the punch out, it'll follow the path and everything should be lined up and there shouldn't be any frustration. Um, it's hard to describe the orientation of the spring that is supposed to be mounted to the trigger. So I want you to bear with me and just know that I can't easily describe that. I would go to your instructions and make sure that it's oriented the same way that any illustrations you have for your trigger are oriented, or rely on any good resource. I think the internet is a really good resource for images that are going to be able to get you where you need to go. So after you've got your trigger installed, you can then install your safety selector, because the difficulty you're always going to find is if the safety selector is installed, sometimes it takes a bit of work to maneuver your trigger underneath it, especially if it's one of the nicer triggers. So, or one of the triggers that's a component of a much nicer fire control group. So assemble your safety selector. If it's a rear trapped or a grip trapped spring and detent for your takedown pin, insert that, and then go ahead and assemble your grip. Now, when it comes to the grip, regardless of what variety grip you have, I tend to discard all of the grips that require a flathead screwdriver or a Phillips head screwdriver. I like the ones that or require a hex head. And I'll tell you the reason is because I can stand up that screw in the hex head bit all day long and basically attach my grip to my upper receiver as easily as I've ever found, because the screw balances on the head of your driver. You can easily insert it in the hole of your grip, find the hole in your upper or your lower receiver, and then tighten down the two of them. Of course, the orientation is a little difficult if you've got springs everywhere, but you'll see that if you snug up your grip onto the piece of aluminum on your lower that fits into the grip, it should stay in position relatively easily. You might have to rock the grip back and forth to get the orientation of the attachment bolt in the right, I guess, at the right angle so that the threads catch, but I've never really encountered a great deal of difficulty with that. And once you do get it started, I think it's important to make sure that your springs are not going to be trapped or bent or out of position. I've screwed down a grip or two and had a spring off center, off kilter, and basically all I did was smash the spring to pieces. So just make sure your springs are oriented in the proper direction. There are some recesses in some of the grips. It just depends on what you've got. So I think that will put you in a position where you've got your trigger, bolt catch, mag release, front takedown, or no, front pivot pin, rear takedown pin, and the appropriate detents in place. Now, if your rear takedown pin does not have the spring and detent trapped by your grip, more than likely it's going to be trapped by an end plate. So in that case, you can leave that entire assembly until last, since that component of the lower parts kit is really mostly irrelevant until you get ready to install your receiver tube extension. So one of the things that I tend to like to do is to not actually put the spring in the hole that requires it. Uh, bear with me for a sec. The difficulty of flying solo is that I don't have anybody to give me a segue so I can take a drink. So when I am putting my receiver tube extension in place, I do not have the spring for the spring and detent assembly that's going to secure my rear takedown pin. I don't have that spring in place, and I'll tell you why. As you're rotating your receiver tube extension into the threads of the receiver, your end plate is going to be rotating every time you do a full circle. Eventually, what's going to happen is you're going to tighten that tube up to the point where your end plate is going to catch that spring. As it clears it, it's going to go flying across the room. I think I've lost at least 3 that way. So take it out, secure down your receiver tube, and you're going to have a trapped, I guess it's a pin of sorts, and spring that's going to be right in front of the lip of that at your 6 o'clock position when you're looking into the tube. It's going to be a rather, well, it'll be at that point the last 2 pieces of your lower parts kit, so it should be hard to miss. Should not be hard to miss. But what you're going to want to do is not insert those pieces until you've got your, well, your receiver extension. You're not going to have that in place until your receiver extension is basically screwed into your receiver far enough to begin to actually trap it. That's another thing I've shot across the room, because that point of that retention pin does tend to gouge you pretty good. So you'll have to keep track of those 2 components, that spring on your rear takedown pin and the assembly that's going to have a spring and detent to trap under the lip of your buffer extension. So at that point, when you've got it all the way threaded in, I keep going just far enough over threading it so that I can see clearly into the receptacle for my spring to hold the detent in place for my rear takedown pin. I set my spring, I hold it down with my thumb, I rotate the receiver tube extension back into its proper place, and I shouldn't have too much in the way of spring displacement. So at this point, what I basically do is carefully maneuver that end plate closer to the receiver until it lies flush, and I hold that seated with my hands or thumb while I basically tighten up my castle nut. So at this point, it will trap that spring, and now my rear takedown pin is properly installed. Now, that does bring to mind the issue that I didn't tell you, which is when you're going to prepare the receiver tube extension to be installed into your receiver, you're going to thread the castle nut on first, and you're going to back it into the receiver as far as the threads go. There will be an end plate that has a groove that lines up with a groove on your receiver extension. You're going to basically slide that back against your castle nut. So then you should just have the threaded end of your tube ready to be mated to your receiver. So when you get all of those components in place, you should have a pin that is at 6 o'clock just below the lip of your receiver. And I want you to know that you do not have to tighten that, nor do I think you'll be able to tighten that tube too far past the point where that lip actually touches that assembly. It's just going to barely cross over the lip, the edge of that spring and detent assembly, and it's just going to trap it there. Now, that assembly basically keeps your buffer and buffer spring inside the tube and prevents them from, leaping out or, getting out. Its shape has a mirror or an opposite mirror. I don't know how you express that. There's a groove in the bottom of your bolt that basically that tip of that pin is going to ride through. And so the bolt is, of course, machined to account for the fact that it's there. Now, with that in place, with the appropriate tools, you should be able to tighten down the castle nut, and that should keep your receiver extension tube in place. Now, from time to time, they will back out. Castle nuts have the ability to loosen, and when they loosen, your tube's going to start basically, it's going to rotate in the receiver, and it's going to provide some instability, and you're going to just not have a really good stable rifle at that point. So some people actually will put I guess they'll stake it. They essentially drive a punch into the edge of the end plate, and that deformation of steel is oriented to basically trap the castle nut in one of the many, I guess it's just a little open space. I think if you look at it, you'll see the little spaces I'm talking about on the leading edge of your castle nut. So that should allow you to stake it in place. You've always got people out there that are adherents of the blue Loctite and red Loctite. I don't do a great deal of Loctiting, but I suppose that is one of the places where you can. I would recommend the blue Loctite as opposed to red for that particular component. So if we go back from the beginning, we've installed our mag release, our bolt catch. We've installed our trigger. We've installed our safety selector. We've installed our rear detent. We've installed our grip. We've installed our receiver tube extension. And at this point, the only two pieces that are internal are going to be those for the hammer and those for the spring and buffer. So with regard to the hammer, once again, the spring orientation is something that you should see or seek a good set of instructions so that you can more than adequately do what you need to have that done for you. So my recommendation is to go out and just find a good installation video or a good set of installation instructions that will help you get to that place. So once you have installed your hammer, you are now in a good place to essentially test fire the rifle. What you want to make sure of is this: that hammer falling on the back of your magwell has the power to damage your lower receiver. So you never want to let your hammer fall without a bolt in place or something to basically absorb the impact of a falling hammer. I always put my thumb just at the top of the hammer, so all it does is thump my digit. Now, you want to make sure that your safety selector is going to keep it safe, and that when you roll the safety selector off, your rifle is going to drop the hammer when the trigger is pulled. If you keep the hammer, or I'm sorry, if you keep the trigger fully depressed and you roll the hammer back. When you release the trigger, you will see or you will feel your disconnector basically reset the hammer. At this point, if you pull your trigger back again, you're going to drop the hammer once more. These are some of the elementary tests that you're going to do to make sure that your fire control group is doing what it needs to do. This is not going to catch anything really obscure or strange. It's not going to catch anything that you may have done to your fire control group yourself by your own efforts. But it will tell you whether or not it's going to reset, whether or not it's going to drop the hammer when you pull the trigger, and whether or not your safety is going to work. So go through that exercise a few times, make sure everything's going to do what it needs to do, and at that point you should be okay. So the spring and the buffer, as they go into the buffer tube, the tip of that catch is going to basically ride the spring all the way in. And so that's a little bit difficult when you're pulling it out. Pushing it in is not quite as difficult, I've found. Some of you may have a differing opinion, but it shouldn't be that difficult. However, just exert some nominal force and get it in there. It should be just fine. So with that, I think it's safe to say your lower receiver is assembled. You do, of course, still have the issue of putting a stock on the back, but the stock is really, it's dressing up the remainder of the rifle at this point. Whatever stock you've got, it will fit cleanly over the buffer tube extension, the receiver tube extension. And all you have to do is lift whatever retaining bolt or locking system you have out of the way so that it slides into the groove where your multiple position detents are going to be. So I know I went through that pretty fast. I hope I didn't make anything too obscure. Certainly, we'd be happy to answer any questions and take some time to get down to the nitty gritty as slowly as we need to make it clear. But I think that is a good verbal description of everything that you're going to need to do when you're assembling your rifle. Now, of course, the show has been working hard to try to get videos up so that you will all be able to see these individual pieces at play when the time comes for you to build your own rifle. And of course, this is a part of our effort to increase our production values so that you can continue to find the show relevant and helpful and basically just an awesome resource. So I think that I have spoken long enough to give you guys a pretty muddy and grim description of what it is to build a lower receiver. And I will do my best with your feedback and your questions to help clear up that murky mess. So I think with that, we're going to call tonight's main topic done, but I would like to continue and let you know that Otis Technology has provided us just a mountain of rifle maintenance tools and cleaning kits for the AR-15 and AR-10. We've been tasked with giving them away, and we have been providing in the last 2 weeks, I guess in the last week and this coming up week, Instagram opportunities to enroll for a chance to win some of the awesome products made by Otis Technology. So we'll be giving away a complete MSR cleaning kit in either 556 or 762 in the middle of each month, which will be next week, I believe. Let me check my calendar for you. No, not next week. It'll be the 18th that we'll be drawing our winner. So next week on the 11th to the 17th is when you can enroll for that giveaway. But in the middle of each month, up until Christmas, we'll be giving away that MSR cleaning kit. But in the intervening weeks, we'll be giving away a number of awesome tools and gun cleaning components that'll just help making the job that much easier. Finally, during Christmas, we'll be giving away an Otis Technology Elite cleaning system to one lucky winner, and that'll be the end of our giveaway. So for this week, we pulled the name of Cole McMillan, Koal McMillan. So Cole, we will be sending you an email. We'll be reaching out through the Facebook message system. Check your other folder for that message. And also, if you hear this notice or find it on Facebook, just reach out to the show and let us know that you've heard that you're a winner, and give us your address. So with that, I'm going to move on to some feedback. So Mike writes in, guys, great show as usual. Thanks for revisiting the AR build. Really enjoyed this episode. Really been thinking about a 264 LBC build, but not sure when it may happen. Any coverage of muzzle brakes and or suppressors would interest me for show topics. I know it's a revisit for muzzle brakes. Well, Mike, we've been actually talking about trying to get into muzzle brakes, but really that part of the AR world has exploded. I think that there might actually be too many for any one show or blog or group of reviewers to actually get their arms around, but we'll do our best to marshal whatever resources we can find so we can give you some information from our perspective. So then J.S. Cantor writes in, I really think that you are going to like your Daniel Defense buttstock. And I think this must be to Anthony, who just ordered one. He says, I bought one for my build and I think it's great. Well, J.S., thank you very much for your feedback. We do appreciate it when you write in. I know Anthony's real excited about his buttstock. So, Joe C. wrote in. He said, hey guys, always a great show. I have semi-finished my build up to optics and can read all about them, but until I can see them in a store, they'll have to wait. You always ask for a list of the builds, so here goes. Now, I've put Joe's list up in the show notes, but he's got a good start with the Mega Arms, Mountain, billet upper and lower set. You got some Daniel Defense furniture. You got JP Rifle Silent Capture Spring, a Raptor charging handle. Wow, Geisley trigger, Levesky, Diamond Head, Battle Arms Development. You know, Joe, you just put together some awesome gear here. I'm really impressed with the selection, and I would recommend anybody that wants to see it to go up to the show notes and take a look at what Joe's put together. But Joe finishes off, tried very hard to make sure everything I bought was made in the USA. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll send you some Instagram pics and let you know how it looks. All right, Joe, thanks a lot. So listen, I'm going to go through the outro as best I can. Of course, I have a head cold. I've been trying my very best not to make any obscure, obscene, or just plain old gross noises for you. So let me know if I did well. Otherwise, here we go with the outro. Send us any questions or comments to feedback@ar15podcast.com. You can always send us a recorded voicemail by using the SpeakPipe plugin on the right-hand side of the podcast website. You can subscribe and listen to the podcast for free on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you would leave us a review, it would help place the show higher in the searches of other potential listeners. We invite you to share your pics with us on Instagram @AR15 Podcast, and you can tag your pictures with hashtag AR15 Podcast for our benefit as well. Follow us on G+ to watch us live at plus.google.com /AR15 Podcast. Check out your YouTube page, or our YouTube page, at youtube.com/c/AR15 Podcast. Also follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/AR15 Podcast. Check out the other great podcasts on the Firearms Radio Network. I know the guys do a lot of really awesome work. I know that many of you don't shoot just ARs. as much as it may pain me to say. So see if there's some other shows out there that really do touch on your interest in the firearms industry. I'll be sure we can meet any need you have. So don't forget to use our Brownells affiliate link for all of your AR-15 parts at ar15podcast.com/parts. Finally, Amazon is the go-to site for most anybody doing internet commerce shopping. And if you use our affiliate link, you can help the show also continue to provide great content every week. So with that, I think I'll let you all go. Try to go to bed early and get over that. Have a great week, and we'll see you again very soon.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv.